Buyurun hocam.
Dear participants, hi. This is Professor Dr. Tuğba Karabulut. Today we are having 44th Science and Society meeting, and I am really proud of it. And we have a very distinguished guest, Professor Dr. Patrick Wright. He is from University of South Carolina. He is a well-known human resource management professor, and we are very happy that we are hosting him today. Welcome, Professor Wright. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I hope we will, listen your presentation, and then, of course, we would like to see you in our university whenever you want. So please, the stage is yours. You can start.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank all of you for attending this session today. I always appreciate the opportunity to share some of the research that I've been working on, particularly over the past couple of years. So just to give you a little bit of background of where this research comes from and just some personal background, let me just kind of take you through my academic journey. That is, I graduated from Wheaton College outside of Chicago, Illinois, and got my bachelor's degree in psychology there. We always joke about, getting a bachelor's in psychology makes you uniquely qualified to do nothing and mediocrely qualified to do anything. So I chose to go to graduate school instead of trying to get a job, and went to Michigan State University. And there's a number of reasons. As a undergraduate, I had used a book, actually two books in my industrial organizational psychology class. And Ken Wexley was the author or co-author of both of those books. And he was a professor at Michigan State University. And I went there, really thinking that I was going to get to work with him, which he had promised. And that's the way everything started out for the first 3 years I worked with Ken. And then some things happened and there was a falling out, and I ended up working with John Hollenbeck. And that was probably, talk about a God wink, one of the best things that ever happened to me in my career. John had recently come, he'd gotten his PhD at New York University and joined as a brand new assistant professor at Michigan State. He was doing mostly goal setting research, and that had interested me, but it wasn't something that Ken Wexley had been interested in. And so I asked John if he would be my dissertation chair, and he agreed to do that, and really learned how to do research the right way from John. He ended up being a editor at Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, just recently won the Career Achievement Award in the OB division of the Academy. Previously, he won the Career Achievement Award in the HR division of the Academy. But John really helped mentor me in terms of what it means to do good research. So I got my PhD at Michigan State, and then my first job was at the University of Notre Dame. And Notre Dame was at the time a kind of I'd say not quite a second level research institution that was trying to become a first level research institution in their College of Business. I went there, and in many ways, again, it was a great opportunity. I was blessed to be there at the time I was there, because as a new PhD, I really didn't have the bandwidth or kind of the maturity to guide PhD students. And I was working on lab studies, and so I got a master's student that was assigned to me as an RA, and he was able to conduct all of the lab studies that I was needing to do while I was at Notre Dame. And so I spent 2 years on the faculty at Notre Dame, and then left to go to Texas A&M University, which at the time, Texas A&M was viewed as probably the best job in the country. For a few reasons. One of them was that they had a strong reputation for research. They were always kind of a top 10 institution in terms of research productivity. Two is that they had a great mix of strategy, organizational behavior, and HR people on the faculty there. And I say Mike Hitt was the editor of AMJ at the time when I got there. They also had Bob Hoskison, Bert Cannella, who's turned out to be a big star, came in as well as an assistant professor the year I came in. And Jay Barney was there. Obviously, Jay being a huge name in terms of the resource-based view of the firm. And so, again, being blessed to be there at that time, I got to sit in on all of the, even though I was kind of an HR guy, I was interested in strategic HR, and getting to sit in on job talks from strategy applicants, hearing the questions that Mike Hitt and Bob Hoskison and Jay Barney would ask, just being with them at meetings and lunches and learning much more of the strategy side from strategy people, as opposed to how HR oriented folks kind of interpreted what was going on in strategy. Again, that was a huge opportunity for me, and I spent 7 years there really learning strategy from a strategy perspective. Not that I would claim to be a strategy person, but at least having a deeper knowledge of that. From there, I went to Cornell University, and Cornell at the time was, without a doubt, the #1 program for master's students in HR, and that was in the Industrial and Labor Relations School. That MILR degree, it was really kind of highly sought. Our students were highly sought after by companies. We also had this Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies, which had about, when I got there, it was about 45 companies that were partner companies that paid, at the time, I think it was $15,000 a year, maybe it was $12,000 to be part of the center. And so again, the blessing of being there was twofold. One is that having that center, it really got me in touch with the practice community. So it was always the chief human resource officers that were the representatives of their company at board meetings, at center meetings. I got a chance to interact with them and hear them talk about what they were struggling with or what they were doing, which gave me a great interest and exposure to the problems that organizations face, as opposed to what we were doing research on at the time. And I say contrasting, A&M was great for academics, but had no links to practice. Cornell had a strong academic background, but tremendous links to practice. And the second part of the blessing about being there is that the center, because companies were paying, it provided a number of resources, financial resources, to fund the research that I was interested in doing, paying for a PhD student as an RA, paying for travel, paying for any type of data collection that we needed. And so I spent 16 years there at Cornell. A great time of learning and growing. And just to give you some background, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, which is hot. My wife grew up in South Florida, south of Miami, which is hot. Cornell is located in Ithaca, New York, which is frozen 6 months out of the year. And so I joke about the fact that in about year 15, my wife informed me that she was moving south, and my choice was whether or not I wanted to move with her. And so we began looking for opportunities, and that's what brought me to the University of South Carolina. And it was a great place for a few reasons. One is that they're just kind of really productive colleagues. Rob Ployhart, who's just an amazingly productive researcher, who was also doing stuff in the strategic human capital space. Anthony Nyberg, another productive researcher in the human capital space. So really productive researchers. The second thing is that they had a master's program in HR that was kind of an okay program. It was a regional program, not a big national reputation, but the program did exist. And so it was a great opportunity to try and help build. As I always talk about, when when I was at Cornell, Cornell was great when I got there, and it was great when I left. So all I can ever say is that I didn't screw it up while I was there. Whereas at South Carolina, it was, kind of average when I got there. And what we've been able to do as a faculty is really grow that program to where in the minds of people that recruit from both Cornell and South Carolina, our students are as good as Cornell students. Our faculty is as good, if not better, than the faculty at Cornell. So it's been a really exciting time over the last 12 years or 11 years, starting my 12th year at South Carolina. I'm just seeing the growth of the program. And also, while I've been at South Carolina, I founded the Center for Executive Succession. And this is a research center, kind of similar to what CARS did, but focused purely on executive succession, and in particular, CEO succession. We have currently about 54 partner companies. Again, they pay $15,000 a year to be part of the center. From that, we do quantitative studies. I'll talk a little bit later about we do a survey of chief human resource officers every year around partly what their role is, but then a number of issues with regard to executive succession. We do interviewing studies, interviewing board members, CEOs, chief HR officers about various aspects of either CEO succession or executive succession. And so again, it's been a great opportunity to merge both the academic research and the kind of practice community, so that the research we're doing is actually research that is beneficial to companies. So that's kind of the schools I went to. Let's talk a little bit about my research agenda. And really, as you've kind of heard already, there's three main components to that. One is, as I mentioned, when I was a PhD student at Michigan State, I got interested in strategic human resource management, but we really didn't have anyone doing research there. Scott Snell, who was my office mate and kind of PhD program mentor, had gotten interested in strategic HR. And we had some strategy faculty members there who, we took the strategy seminars, but there was no one at Michigan State talking about strategic human resource management. And so, my dissertation was in goal setting, but I had a strategic HR paper that was written during that time and was interested in it. But, really, from a practical standpoint for the PhD students, in terms of trying to get tenure, what I knew is it's a lot easier to do a lab study on goal setting than to try and gather field data around strategic HR. And so I focused about 70% of my time during the probably first 7 to 9 years of my career on goal setting stuff, and about 30% of my time on strategic HR stuff. And it started with a Journal of Management, or probably the first big publication was with the Journal of Management yearly review of management paper on theories of strategic HRM, which what Gary McMahon and I tried to do was look over the entire literature of SHRM at the time, see which theories were being used in that, and then develop kind of a model and review of the theories that existed in SHRM. And we've continued to maintain some things. We updated that in 2011. But that's certainly the theoretical side of SHRM has been a big part of what I've been interested in. Then, along with everyone else in strategic HR, I got into doing research on HR practices and performance. And this really came from a great opportunity. While I was at Cornell, the head of HR at Cisco Foods wanted us to do a climate survey. And the reason he wanted it was they had about 70 business units that run reasonably autonomously. And he was trying to get them to understand the importance of employee engagement and how that would impact their performance. And so he wanted to gather this climate data. And to be able to show that the business units within Cisco that had the highest climate also had the best customer satisfaction and had the best financial performance. We actually cut a deal that we would charge him less to do the climate survey if he would allow us to put HR practices on the survey as well. And so for about 6 years, we would do the annual survey of the climate survey of Cisco, all of Cisco's business units. And so, we've actually published probably 3 or 4 different papers from that data set, all of them being a different year's data, so that we never kind of put it all together. But, the first year's data came out in one paper, the next year's data came out in another paper. And so that provided a great platform and data set to be able to do a lot of stuff on the HR practices and performance area. The third area, and this goes back into graduate school for my organization theory class. I actually was working on a paper around HR flexibility. And we'll talk more about that because that's really the theme of this presentation today. But I worked with Scott Snell, and we had an Academy of Management review paper kind of laying out a model of HR flexibility. And that's been taken and run with a number of researchers, and often they've asked me to be part of that as well. So that's certainly a big component. And then last was this area of strategic human capital. As one of the things that we found is that strategy researchers were looking at human capital, and HR psychology researchers were looking at human capital. And so the Strategic Management Society created a strategic human capital interest group as an attempt to create a platform for a conversation between the strategy people interested in these topics and the HR people interested in these topics. And so I spent a lot of time doing work on strategic human capital. Second thing I mentioned a little bit was the Chief Human Resource Officer. So while I was at Cornell and I was the director of the Center for Advanced HR Studies, and we were having an advisory board meeting where we had about 10 or 12 chief HR officers in the room talking about the things that the center would be working on. And Bill Conity, who was the head of HR at GE at the time, was talking about the fact that he had been in the role for 10 years or 15 years, and he said, the role is just changing so much and so quickly, and there's no data on how this role is changing over time. And so this is something where we should be that source of knowledge around the Chief Human Resource Officer role. And so that was a great challenge. I began doing interviews and focus groups with chief HR officers, essentially doing a job analysis of trying to break up their job into different components and what were the things that they did. Out of that, we came up with a model that has seven components to the chief HR officer role. And we began doing an annual survey of the chief human resource officers. And that started in 2009, and we've done the survey every year. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about the survey itself in a little bit, but it's been a great opportunity to learn about CHROs, what they do, the challenges they face, build relationships with them to where they share more information than they probably should about the things that they face. And then the last, as I mentioned, is around CEO succession. Again, when we started we did the CHRO survey, and it was probably in about 2013. And we always ask our advisory board about, I had kind of a semi-informal group of CHROs and would say, what are the things that you want to hear about? You want to hear your colleagues say what they're doing on the survey. And a number of them said, the CEO succession piece. And that was that if you go back and I think about 2011, 2012, Hewlett Packard or HP had gone through like 4 CEOs in I think 3 years, just a tremendous set of mistakes. And the boards of directors began to realize that, that is their main governance role, is choosing the next CEO. And so they all began to say, we need to be more focused on how do we do this. And well, let's see who on the executive team is responsible for, kind of hiring, developing, all of that. Oh, that's the CHRO. And so the boards were beginning to look to CHROs of, so how do we do this? Well, CHROs had never been part of these processes. And so they were, kind of dying to know what's everyone else doing. So we did that survey and came up with some really interesting data at the time. But then when we wanted to start a center at South Carolina, Kevin Cox, who was the head of HR at American Express, when I asked him about the topic, he said, oh, without a doubt, executive succession. He said boards are increasingly focused on it. There's no good data out there. The only data that exists is done by consulting firms or search firms. And you just never know, whether or not what they're saying is truth or is it simply to sell their practice. And so he said, if there was, an entity or an organization that was going to be the objective source of knowledge around this, that wasn't selling anything, that would be great. And so, again, we started the Center for Executive Succession, talked a little bit about some of the interviewing studies we've done, the CHRO data. And what the CHRO data does is, we always try to have stuff on the survey that could be then used in a academic publication as well. So again, for instance, we actually got had the CHROs evaluate their CEO on a narcissism scale a few years ago, and that data became the dissertation of one of our PhD students, and we have a paper out that's still trying to find a home regarding how narcissism affects CEO succession processes. And again, just to give you some more specifics on how we do the survey, we work with the Human Resource Policy Association, and the HR Policy Association describes themselves as the professional association of chief HR officers. They have about 400 CHROs that are part of their membership. They tend to be kind of Fortune 500 companies for the most part, because the amount of money that HRPA charges really kind of keeps smaller companies from being able to pay to be members. So it tends to be, again, large multinational companies, mostly based in the US. Occasionally there are some that are based outside the US. And so they share their membership list with us every year. We send out the survey to the roughly 400 CHROs that are their members. We tend to get about 130 to 150 responses back, which again is a pretty significant response rate when you're talking about people in the C-suite. We just in May completed the 2023 survey. I've written up one of the reports from that, and I'm working on the second one now. But we had 170 responses on that survey. Again, a really good response rate overall. And we've every year we kind of do different things. This year we had some components about ESG and what's the CHRO's role in ESG, and which different C-suite members have responsibility for the different components to ESG. And then also we asked about socio-political activity, which is, again, some of the strategy researchers like Don Hambrick have been pushing for the fact that CEOs need to be making statements on political issues. And I'm not sure that's the case. Some of the data suggests that that's a risky proposition, but if nothing else on this survey, what we wanted to do was to get an understanding of how companies go about making decisions when and if they're going to comment on political activities or political issues. who's involved in that, and then kind of who ends up making the decision. Now, again, what this survey does is it allows us this insider perspective on aspects of the CEO and the executive leadership team that I like to say, like, no one else can get. So, for instance, if you look at the CEO succession literature, what people often do if they're trying to look at the successors to the CEO is that they look at the named executive officers, who shows up in on the website as the executive leadership team, or who's named in the prospectus that goes out, anything like that. And anyone that knows anything about that knows that that's not an accurate view of who are the people that are being considered a potential successor to the CEO. For instance, the chief marketing officer is probably not in that list, even though they show up. We know the chief HR officer is not a potential successor, and yet they show up on the website. And so what we do is that we actually ask about the number of successors in the 0 to 3 year time frame, the number of successors in the 3 to 5 year time frame, and then actually ask them about the diversity. So, how many of those successors are white male? How many are white female? How many are black male? How many are black female? So we actually get a real accurate view of the successors in the pipeline, both the number of successors that they're looking at and the diversity of that succession pool. The other thing I mentioned was the CEO narcissism. Again, when we put it on the survey, we didn't say that. We asked about the CEO's leadership style, but it was an actual narcissism scale. We've asked about the dynamics among the executive leadership team members in terms of cohesion, cooperation, how well did they get along with one another? Again, kind of hard, almost impossible for anyone to get that information without an insider. And in particular, the CHRO is a good insider for that, because if you understand the chief HR officer's role, they're usually the person that the team goes to when they have a problem with either another person on the team or a problem with the CEO. Part of the CHRO's role is this kind of a counselor and coach to the executive leadership team. So they have a pretty good sense of that. And then 2 years ago, again, it's in this increasingly political environment where CEOs are being asked to make statements. And there is some research in the strategy literature on how a CEO's kind of political beliefs impact different aspects of their decision making. And usually what it's the way that they get at the political leanings of the CEO is that they look at the often what the CEO, how the CEO donates to different candidates or different parties in the political process. And again, that's not a bad measure, but there are reasons that people donate to different political parties. That doesn't mean they agree with it. It just means that they know that's the right way to do it. So, in the U.S., if you have a Democrat-controlled Senate and a Democrat president, as a CEO, you're going to give money to Democrats if you want to get a voice with the people that are making decisions. Even though you may be a Republican, you're going to give money that way. So again, CHROs have kind of through their conversations, have an idea of what the beliefs are. And so 2 years ago, we asked about the CEO's political beliefs. One other thing is that, politics is kind of a broad area. And so what we want to do is break it into economic issues, which are really the business related issues, taxes, regulation, things like that. And then social issues, kind of LGBTQ rights, diversity issues, things like that. So breaking it up that way, because we suspected that people could be, economically conservative and socially liberal. And so kind of having an overall rating of that isn't very useful. So again, 2 years ago, we asked about the CEO. And then this past year, not the 2023, but the 2022, we asked about the CEO's political leanings as well as the CHRO's political leanings, because we are interested, in the US, when people complain about, woke management or whatever, they'll often say something about, this is something you would get from your HR person, right? And the assumption is that HR people are really far to the left, and that that's not necessarily indicative of the company as a whole. And so we thought it was a great opportunity to ask. And so, just you kind of think about this, and what do you think CEOs and CHROs fall on economic issues? Well, on the economic issues, it's actually kind of interesting. The CHROs are pretty much aligned with the CEO. Again, we had a 7-point scale where 7 was, kind of far right conservative. 1 was far left liberal, or liberal progressive. And, virtually no one fell in the far left category. And you see that on the whole, both of them are kind of in the moderate right. CEOs are slightly more conservative than CHROs, but not significantly. However, on the social issues, you begin to see a pretty big difference. And that is that CEOs, almost have this bimodal distribution where they're either moderate or liberal, but they tend to be moderate left on average. The CHROs, on the other hand, tend to be pretty much left. You wouldn't even really describe them as moderate left. They're much further left than the CEOs are. And I was talking to one of my CHRO friends about this work, and he said, well, actually, that's driven by the women CHROs. And so we broke that up and said, well, how do we compare male and female CHROs? And again, on the economic issues, what you see is that males are more conservative than females. Females are kind of moderate. Males are moderate right. But on social issues, the female CHROs are far left. I think it's about 64% of the females fall in the furthest 2 left categories in there. And again, the males are kind of moderate left, but the females are far left. Again, this is something that we find, as we say, we don't know if that's good or bad. We're not making any kind of a value judgment, but it is interesting data to look at, because if in fact CHROs are filling a blind spot for the CEO, then that's great. They're bringing a perspective to the decision-making that needs to be brought. The other risk, though, is that they're misaligned with the CEO. And the CEOs begin to look at them as social workers instead of business people. And that could potentially be a negative thing going forward. So again, this gives you an idea of the kinds of data that we're able to capture through the survey. So having said that, let's move on to the HR flexibility, really the topic of the conversation today. And the HR flexibility research goes back into the 90s. Milliman et al. In 1991 had an AMR piece on HR flexibility. And it was a great piece. It didn't really flesh out what it means, but it was a really good foundational piece to describe kind of the concept of HR flexibility. And then, Scott Snell and I did this 98 piece where we were actually trying to look at the distinctions between fit and flexibility, because again, the strategic HR literature at the time was really focused on fit. And how do we fit our HR systems to the strategy of the business? And so we contrasted the fit with the flexibility and came up with a model that we'll talk about in a little bit. But that 98 piece was probably the first to lay out a model of what HR flexibility is all about. And then since then, at least three dissertations have been done, two of which were published on using that HR flexibility model. And I note that none of them are my doctoral students. It's not me pushing doctoral students. All of them I had tangential relationships with. Masumi Bhattacharya was a PhD student at Syracuse University when I was at Cornell. She came down to take my doctoral seminar. And that's where we talked. It was a strategic HR seminar, but we had a week that we covered HR flexibility. She got interested in that and then took it back up to her dissertation chair, and they put together her dissertation around that. And then Sean Way was a PhD student at Rutgers. He actually had Scott Snell on his dissertation committee. And so we'll talk a little bit about his 2015 piece, but his dissertation was also on HR flexibility. So to describe the construct, begin with construct definition. Our model was built on Sanchez's 1995 SMJ piece on firm flexibility. It wasn't HR flexibility. He talked about flexibility of the firm. And he describes it as a firm's abilities to respond to various demands from dynamic competitive environments. So he's looking overall at how well firms are able to adapt to changes within their competitive environments. And he talked about two components of that you'll see should come up later, and that is resource flexibility and coordination flexibility. In our paper, we kind of adapted and referred to HR flexibility as being a firm's ability flexibility to be a firm's ability to quickly reconfigure resources and activities in response to environmental demands. And then that took us into HR flexibility, where we defined HR flexibility and kind of conceive of it as the extent to which a firm's human resources possess skills and behavioral repertoires that can give a firm options for pursuing strategic alternatives in the firm's competitive environment, as well as the extent to which the necessary HR practices can be identified, developed, and implemented quickly to maximize the flexibilities inherent in those human resources. And so I say that because there's really three components that we focused on. Skills are really the skills of the workforce, the kind of inherent skills that they have. The behavioral repertoires are the behaviors that they are able to exhibit. Okay, and the distinction that we often made is that when we were working on this paper, Continental Airlines in the US, which is now part of United Airlines, had just gone through a big turnaround. And one of the components of that turnaround was they had implemented an on-time bonus, so that every month in which Continental was one of the top three airlines in the US in on-time performance, every employee at Continental got I think it was a $64 bonus or something for that. And in 1 month, they went from worst in the industry in on-time performance to number 2 in the industry in on-time performance. Okay, and so our point about that is that those employees had the skills to be able to get the planes out on time, but they just weren't exhibiting the behaviors. So in 1 month, when suddenly there's an incentive for them to behave a different way, they behave a different way. And so that's why what we're trying to make the distinction here is that you can have the skill to do something and yet choose not to do it. And so we talked about those behavioral repertoires, and part of that, again, when you get into the change literature, we get used to doing things a certain way, and it's kind of hard to break out of that behavioral repertoires. Here's the way we handle this problem. Here's the way we handle this problem. We always handle this problem this way, so that's the way we're going to handle it going forward. versus being able to step back and say, well, you know what, maybe there's a different solution. Maybe we need to behave differently to handle the problem this time. And then last is the HR practices. And that is, what the HR function has developed as a way to manage people. If in fact we need to adapt, then we need to be able to change our HR practices to fit and to help get people to exhibit the right behaviors or develop the skills necessary and apply those skills to this new competitive environment. Sean Way, again, I've worked with Sean on a lot of stuff, and he's the co-author on this paper. His 2018 piece, I guess it's our 2018 piece, described HR flexibility as an organizational level capability consisting of people who possess a variety of competencies and the HR practices that can be used to effectively utilize those people to be adaptive and successful in a dynamic environment and to facilitate the capacity of the organization to pursue strategic alternatives. Now, again, you'll notice the difference here is that whereas previously we talked about skills and behaviors, this paper now kind of combines those into competencies. And you'll see why that is when you talk about the research that's gone on here. So again, the conceptual model was based on Sanchez's ideas of resource flexibility and coordination flexibility. Resource flexibility is the extent to which a resource can be applied to a larger range of alternative uses. The cost and difficulty of switching the use of a resource from one alternative use to another, and the time required to switch from one use to another. So it's kind of like you have this thing, can you use it in different ways? You have a hammer, can you use the hammer on different kinds of things? And how costly is it to move that hammer from one use to another use? Coordination flexibility, on the other hand, is the extent to which a firm can resynthesize the strategy, reconfigure the chain of resources, and redeploy the resources. So when we talk about coordination flexibility, in a sense, we're kind of moving from the hammer to the whole toolkit. And so coordination is saying, can we reconfigure everything that we need in terms of the hammer, the screwdriver, the saw, to be able to use to quickly get those resources in a structure that we can use them for a new purpose. And so again, that's the major distinction that Sanchez brought out at that time. And so what we did with our model was to say, how do these things apply to those three components of HR practices, skills, and behaviors? So when you think about a resource flexible HR practice, think of cognitive ability tests versus work sample tests. So again, for those of you that are knowledgeable about selection, a work sample test would be having somebody do a portion of the job as part of a test to see whether or not they can do the job. When I was at Notre Dame, we worked on a consulting project where we developed a selection system for factory service technicians that would come into your house to fix a washing machine. And what we did is we actually created a work sample where we had a washing machine where we had broken the timer for it and had the person come in with their tools and diagnose the washing machine to figure out what the problem is. Okay, so it was a great test of a way to see whether or not somebody could actually do a diagnosis, but you couldn't use that test to select a professor because that work sample is really unique to a specific situation. On the other hand, a general cognitive ability test is capturing whether or not you have an innate ability to learn. And so that cognitive ability test can be useful for hiring a factory service technician because they're going to have to learn. And it can also be used for hiring a professor because they're going to have to learn. And so this is the idea of what HR practice resource flexibility looks like. Skills would be kind of a broad versus a narrow skill set. Again, do I have a very specialized set of skills that I can only do this job, or do I have a broad set of skills that would allow me to do a number of different jobs? And then behaviors is, again, this breadth of behavioral scripts. Do I have the ability to think about that I've tried things different ways and I can apply a different script to a different situation? Now, when we think about coordination flexibility, with HR practices, coordination flexibility deals with the fit to changing strategies. Because again, if the strategy changes, one of the assumptions in strategic HR is that our HR practices need to change to fit that new strategy, to help execute that strategy. Going back many years, we were doing a study called the State of the Art and Practice Study, interviewing a number of chief HR officers. And one of the questions that I asked them was, again, looking at this fit between HR practices and strategy, I said, okay, so assume that your strategy changed tomorrow. How long would it take for you to come up with the design of a new HR system that would help execute that strategy? And then once you had it designed, second question, how long would it take you from the design of that to actually get it up and running in the organization to begin executing that new strategy? And the answer that came back was that to design it, it would probably take about 6 months to design what the new system would look like. And then it would take somewhere between 12 and 18 months to implement that in the organization. So you're looking at your strategy changes. It's going to take you somewhere between 1.5 years and 2 years to get your HR system up in place. Again, the problem with that is that 2 years from now, your firm probably has a different strategy than that system was designed to implement. So again, this is that idea of coordination strategy. How quickly can we reconfigure our HR practices? The skills is, think about it as project teams. How quickly can we put together a project team that has all of the necessary skills required of that particular project? And then the behaviors is, again, kind of the diversity in the behavioral scripts. Do we have different perspectives, different ways of approaching problems within the organization that would allow us a broader set of solutions to a particular organizational problem? So this was the Wright and Snell model of talking about these three components: practices, skills, and behaviors, both from a resource coordination perspective and a coordination perspective, resource flexibility and coordination flexibility. So the HR flexibility construct validation, again, Shawn Way's dissertation was trying to develop a construct valid measure of HR flexibility. And again, Scott Snell was on that dissertation committee. Shawn brought me in later as it got bigger and bigger. He ended up, his dissertation, I think, had like 2 samples in it. But then to try and get it published in Journal of Management, he or we had to keep collecting new samples to address particular problems that were coming up in the review process. But across those 7 samples, we went through the item development and content validation, then an initial factor structure, then convergent and discriminant validity, and then predictive validity. And this is what that ended up looking like in terms of the final model or the final measure of HR flexibility. So again, we had hypothesized up front that it was 6 components or 6 factors. Shawn ended up with 5 factors. And Shawn actually added, which we didn't think about at the time, the idea of contingent workers. It was kind of inherent when you think about flexibility of skills and so on, coordination flexibility with regard to skills, but we didn't address it specifically. And so Shawn added items around contingent workers. And what ended up happening is you can kind of see on this next thing, here were the 6 proposed factors. The results showed that really the resource flexibility broke up, instead of 3 things, the skills and behaviors merged together. In the minds of respondents, they didn't separate skills from behaviors. It was kind of the component. And this is, again, why Sean talks about competencies, which is really that skills and behaviors. And then coordination flexibility, again, with HR practices, skills and behaviors combining, and then skills and behaviors of contingent workers combining. And so those were the 5 ultimate factors that came out of this extensive construct validation of a measure of HR flexibility. So with all of that in mind, what has the research shown? Number of studies that have been conducted on this. I think we're up to about 25 or 30 now. HR flexibility has been shown to be positively related to employee outcomes, to operational outcomes like labor productivity, market or customer outcomes, customer satisfaction, and then to financial outcomes. Most of the papers look at financial outcomes. So HR flexibility, kind of little doubt that HR flexibility is related to performance, but there is some potential work that might look at contingency factors. So, for instance, the Wei et al. 2018 piece found that, in fact, it was positively related to financial performance, but the relationship was stronger in dynamic competitive environments as opposed to stable competitive environments. So, again, universally it seems to work, but stronger in certain circumstances. And so if you look at that research, what this study was designed to do was to address a few different questions. One is, and Sean Wei's been writing this in every paper that he writes, is, so what are the precursors to HR flexibility? What is it that helps build HR flexibility in the organization? How do high performance work systems and HR flexibility simultaneously impact performance? Again, there's, when I talk about 25 or 30 studies on HR flexibility, there are hundreds of studies showing the relationship between high performance work systems and organizational performance. Of the number of studies on HR flexibility, there are 2 that actually reported high performance work system and HR flexibility, but no one ever really tested the way those 2 things interact. So what they found is that, yes, high performance work systems were positively correlated with HR flexibility, but they didn't test for mediation. They didn't test for, are these things independent predictors of performance? So, given the vast literature on high performance work systems and the growing literature on HR flexibility, we thought it was an interesting question would be to understand how they simultaneously impact performance. And then last, as I talked about the moderators that exist with regard to the kind of dynamics of the competitive environment, another question is, how would organizational size moderate the relationship between HR flexibility and performance? Again, Clint Chadwick and his colleagues had done a study on high performance work systems and performance, looking at organizational size as a moderator. And they hypothesized that really from a managerial attention perspective, that high performance work systems require managerial attention. And so to implement that in a small organization is distracting the manager from running the business. And so they wouldn't expect it to be as strongly related, whereas in a larger organization where there's more slack resources, it's less distraction. And so it would be more positively related to performance. And they actually found support for that. So we're hypothesizing pretty much the same thing with regard to HR flexibility, partly from a managerial attention perspective, but partly from an investment perspective. To build that flexibility in requires investment. In a large organization, again, you have more slack financial resources to invest in that. In a smaller organization, you're taking that resource investment from somewhere else. And so we expected that the relationship would be stronger for large organizations relative to smaller organizations. So the data comes from the 8th round of Dave Ulrich's Human Resource Competency Study. So Dave has been doing this study for about 40 years now. Every 5 years, they do an updated study, and it's focused on identifying the new competencies that HR professionals need to succeed in their professional roles and to help drive business success. And it's grown over time to where now it is a global study. They partner with different organizations across the globe. They gather the data, and it's broadened beyond just the HR competencies, but looking at aspects of the HR function, aspects of the organization. Dave's son, Mike Ulrich, was one of my PhD students at University of South Carolina. Dave is kind of slowly stepping out of the HR competency study, and he wanted to hand it off to Mike. And he asked if I would be part of the study for the next 2 rounds to kind of help Mike take it over. And so I did that. And yeah, so that's why the paper that is coming out is actually Mike Ulrich is the first author, Sean Way is the second author, and I'm the third author on it. So I mentioned we had 20 partner associates that helped in the data collection. The way it would work is that we would contact the companies, or the professional associations would contact companies and professionals, ask if they want to participate in this. When they agreed, they provided contact information for their supervisor, for their HR associates and peers, and for their non-HR associates and peers. So we're getting like a 360, and this has been the model of the Ulrich competency study, is a 360 on that individual, rating their competencies along a number of different behavioral items. And so again, the round 8, this is what that looks like, just to give you an idea of the scale. We had about 29,000 respondents overall, over 1,000 organizations represented, about 3,600 of the focal HR participants on whom everyone is evaluating that individual's competencies. Over 3,000 supervisors, almost 12,000 HR peers, and about 10,000 non-HR peers that are part of this study. Okay. Now, again, one of the advantages of using this data sample is that most of the HR, I think almost all of the HR flexibility work, has used a single respondent for the measure of HR flexibility. And really a single respondent for everything, but maybe the performance data. And that might be with a business leader reporting it, or it might be using publicly available data. But this allows us to use multiple respondents for each of the focal variables and to minimize the overlap across that, so we don't have a common method variance problem. So with our sample, in terms of having full data, it ended up being about 8,000 people, representing 306 organizations from 58 countries and 26 industries. And this is how we broke it up, is that for the performance measure, we used the most senior non-HR respondent that was part of the study. Again, kind of like generally it was the supervisor, the boss. And we got over 2 per organization on that. For the high-tech focus variable, we used the junior HR and junior non-HR, so we got about 22 people per organization. The high-performance work system, we used all the HR people, so that was 12.5 per organization. And then for HR flexibility, the junior HR and the all non-HR, so that was about 25 people per organization. The performance measure was 8 items, and we originally thought it was 2 assessing employee outcomes, 2 assessing operational, 2 for customer, and 2 for financial. But we realized is that one of the employee items were employee turnover, and labor productivity. Labor productivity is technically an operational measure. If we actually talk about it now as being 1 employee, 3 operational, 2 customer, and 2 financial. The high-tech focus was one item asking about how critical advancing technologies such as AI, machine learning, digitalization were as part of their strategy. The high-performance work system, we had 7 items. In HR flexibility, we had 6 items. And again, because this was a really extensive survey, we couldn't use the usual, 15 high-performance work system items or the 18 HR flexibility items. So we tried to look at which items are kind of most strongly predictive of performance in the past and use those items. So the high-performance work system scale, here were the items that we used, kind of compensation item, job design or just selection item, performance appraisal item, pay level item, empowerment or kind of a participation item, training item, and another participation item. The HR flexibility, we had a few items that dealt with the HR systems, and kind of captured some of that. Some of the items that captured the breadth of skills and kind of employees' willingness to move to new jobs as the coordination flexibility. So to get into the results, here's the correlation matrix, and again, the overall performance. All of those items I should point out were asking about performance relative to their competitors, which is when you're getting subjective performance measures, that tends to be the best way to do that. Also add all of the scales ended up with high alphas. They all ended up with high ICCs in terms of the aggregation. We got criticism about the high-tech focus item because it was only one item, which displays kind of a lack of knowledge of reliability when reviewers critique that, because internal consistency is only one measure of reliability. Inter-rater reliability is another measure, and it's actually kind of more difficult. And so we actually have high inter-rater reliability on the high-tech focus item. But as you look at this, again, if we're trying to understand how these variables predict performance, first thing, in a bivariate way, all 3 of our focal variables, the high-tech focus, the high-performance work system, and the HR flexibility, all were positively related to performance. Again, anything above 0.11 is significant. And then if you're looking at HR flexibility as the dependent measure, again, all of the variables that we're looking at are related to HR flexibility. High performance work system is highly correlated, not super highly as a concern, but the high-tech focus, the size, as you might expect, the bigger an organization, kind of the less flexible it is. Similarly with age, the older an organization, the less flexible it is. And then the efficiency business strategy, the more companies using an efficiency business strategy, the more flexible that organization is. Then here's our regression results, just to summarize everything. In the first model, you see as we put in all of the controls, that explains about 21% of the variance. And then when we add the 3 focal independent variables, the high performance work system use, the high tech focus, HR flexibility, that explains an incremental R squared of 0.08 or 8% of the variance of incremental variance is explained, which is significant. And then of those 3 variables, what you see is that the high-tech focus was positively related to performance still, and the HR flexibility was positively related to performance. The high-performance work system variable was not. So we actually in the paper have extensive mediation analyses, but suffice it to say from this figure or this table itself, what this suggests is that the high-tech focus, HR flexibility, partially mediates the impact of high-tech focus on performance. High-tech focus is related to HR flexibility, but even after controlling for HR flexibility, it independently predicts performance. On the other hand, the high-performance work system is fully mediated by HR flexibility. Again, we'll talk about some of the caveats to that, but at least in this study, it seems that high-performance work systems help build HR flexibility, and that's how they impact performance. And then last is the moderating hypothesis. And again, what we see is that the size by flexibility interaction term explains an incremental 3% of the variance in performance, which is significant. And that regression rate is significant as well. So this is what that interaction looks like. Now, we have an updated figure because in this case, what we did is we used the high group, the middle group, and the small group, or say the large group, the middle group, and the small group. What we've done is combine different groups in different ways, but however we combine it, you see essentially the same nature of relationships, and that is that HR flexibility is more strongly related to performance among large organizations and less positively related and almost barely related to performance among small organizations. And then we actually did some exploratory analyses, one of which was the idea that we use this overall measure of performance. And again, the data would suggest, because they were highly intercorrelated with one another, that this is one scale. But we wanted to look at, this is the one study that actually looked at different measures of performance. And so we redid those analyses, breaking it up into the separate, so how predicting employee performance, predicting market performance, predicting operational performance, and financial performance. And the results showed that pretty much you get the same relationship as with the overall results, with one exception, and that's the financial performance measure. And this is what that looks like, is that in fact, with regard to financial performance, HR flexibility is negatively related among small organizations, which goes back to our explanation of HR flexibility requires financial investments, and those financial investments don't pay off. And in fact, they're a cost among smaller organizations because they just can't afford, they don't have the slack resources to take that money away. So the summary of results is that HR flexibility partially mediated the relationship between high-tech focus and overall performance. Didn't really talk about that as much. It's not that interesting to me, but HR flexibility fully mediated the relationship between a high-performance work system and overall performance. Now, again, the caveat I'll put on this is that we did this kind of partway through. I mean, I don't know when the pandemic ended, but we did this in late 2020 when there was still, massive change going on. It was a highly dynamic environment for every company during the pandemic. And so, it's not, in one sense, it may be that high performance work system was fully mediated because it was such a dynamic environment, but that, now that things have calmed down a bit, we might see that it is only partially mediating a relationship among companies that are more stable. And then last is that organization size moderated the relationship between HR flexibility and performance, which again, we find to be kind of interesting. In a sense, it's a replication of what happened with high performance work systems, but it hasn't been shown with regard to HR flexibility. So limitations in future research, one is the moderating role of size. Again, the nature of the survey going out to, thousands and thousands of people and the length of it, all we could do is kind of ask for categories of size, but we don't have the actual size measure. In the future, we'd probably want a better measure of high-tech focus, multiple items around different components of what implementing technologies looks like. And then last is the use of the full measures of high-performance work systems and HR flexibility. But again, the nature of this data set with thousands of people and hundreds of organizations, on the one hand, it required cutting back the skills themselves. On the other hand, it's a tremendous global study with multiple respondents, which we think is kind of a really good piece to that. So with that, I'm done, and I'll open it up for questions. If anyone has questions regarding the study, HR flexibility.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Wright. Actually, you are a very well-known professor, and more than 66,000 people cited you. And this research is a very, very huge research with global scope. So thank you very much for sharing this data with us. We appreciate it. Dear Osman Hoca, would you like to ask a question to our professor, Professor Wright? Osman Hoca is our HR professor also. He's
okay, great
professor, so he's interested, of course, to this topic.
Okay, Professor Patrick, welcome, and thank you very much. This is a very useful presentation for us. And can we reach the item of the measure that were used in your research?
Pardon, could you ask the question again? I didn't quite catch it.
Can we reach the item of the measures that you were used in your research?
Yes. So if you want just the items we used here, I'm happy to share the presentation, and I've got those items. At least for the high performance work system, and the other one, the HR flexibility. If you want the high tech focus and performance items, I'm happy to share those as well. Again, I would, if I was sharing stuff, I would, and if you are interested in doing research like this,
yes,
you have the ability.
Yes.
I would use the full HR flexibility scale and the full high performance work system scale. And again, happy to share those as well. Just that's one of the limitations, and I say that from what we've had to deal with in terms of responses from reviewers. That's one of their big criticisms is, well, why didn't you use the full scale? And so I would not wish that on you if you wanted to do this research. So if possible, I'd probably recommend using the full scales.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so Salma, she's our PhD student. Do you want to ask a question, Salma?
A lot for these beneficial lectures. Really, I benefit from it very much. I have questions for you, sir. What advice would you give to human resource management aiming to achieve balance or flexibility of the needs of employee with the strategic goals of the organization?
Yeah, so again, this is actually a great question going back to Dave Ulrich, because Dave, in his original model of HR competencies, came up with a few different roles, one of which was employee advocate, which is what you're talking about putting the interests of employees. Another one was business partner, which was kind of prioritizing the importance of the business. And I think this is a constant paradox that companies face, because the idea is that it's an either or, right? I mean, either we're going to have to put the emphasis on employee outcomes or on business outcomes. And in some cases there is, if the company is facing financial difficulty, and the choice is go bankrupt or lay people off, that does create kind of a zero-sum situation where one thing has to happen and the other one cannot happen. But for the most part, I like to believe that successful companies are successful because they emphasize the importance of employees. And that is that, nothing gets done in an organization effectively without highly skilled employees who are engaged and want to see the organization succeed. And that comes from investing in them, treating them with dignity, involving them in decisions, kind of all of the things that go into a high performance work system scale are the things that one would want to do to create a workforce that has the right skills and that is committed to seeing the organization succeed. And so to me, it's not an either or, it is a path to business success. That if we treat employees well, then all else equal, we're more likely to succeed as a business than if we don't treat employees well. Now, again, the contingencies to that are sometimes the economy tanks, and there are decisions that have to be made. And those may negatively impact employees, or they may negatively impact shareholders.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, we had a CEO and CHRO as part of a Zoom meeting, and they talked about the fact that all of the things that they were doing to protect employees. And when we asked them, well, what does your board of directors, what do your shareholders say about it? And their response was, oh, they love it because they know that that's what's going to make us successful in the long term. Even though we may lose money in the short term, that's what will make us successful in the long term.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yakuba, he is also our PhD student. Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Ojam, to give me this opportunity. And I thank Professor Dr. Patrick Wright for this outstanding performance. It was a lot of information. And my question would be, as the flexibility occur as the response of strategic implementation in organization. So the orientation, there can be diverse orientation due to the age of organization, or maybe due to the extension, or due to the high or hyper competition within the organization. So according to that, there can be variable response to that. And you mentioned the skills and behavioral repertoire. So I want to know the boundary, what will be the limit of implementation and sticking to the HR practice as well.
So the boundary to that's a interesting question, and I guess kind of a difficult question. Again, what we've found with regard to the flexibility in some of the research is that, again, just think about if you're going to try to hire employees that have a broad skill set, and if labor markets work, then you're probably going to have to pay more for employees that have that broad skill set. To create a diversity of behavioral repertoires, you're probably going to need for people to move to different jobs more quickly, to be in jobs where they're uncomfortable, where they do not get kind of into a rut of this is the way we've always done things. And with regard to HR practices, if you're going to have flexible practices, you're going to have to invest in constantly updating those practices so that they don't become institutionalized and too crystallized within the organization. All of those things require money, right? So we have to pay higher wages for the people with broad skill sets. We sacrifice something in productivity because we're putting them in jobs frequently where they aren't necessarily qualified for those jobs. And we're constantly having to update our HR practices. So if you say it costs money to build flexibility into the organization, then the question is, what's the payoff for that? So if you're in a dynamic environment where things are changing constantly and your organization needs to change constantly to adapt to those environmental changes, then that investment is a good investment. because you've built the skill set and the behavioral repertoires and the ability to change your practices that allow you to more quickly adapt to the changes. If, on the other hand, you're in a stable environment that doesn't require that, then you've just wasted a lot of money because you've invested in building capability that is that has no value within your competitive environment. So I think that's probably the answer I would give, is that going back to just thinking about it costs money to build flexibility. And so the question is, when does that flexibility pay off? And I think the easiest answer is it pays off when your environment requires you to change consistently or constantly. And it doesn't pay off if your requirement doesn't require that of you.
Thank you, Professor, for this. You mentioned the point, what's the payoff? And according to that same perspective, in terms of implementation in larger scale within the company regarding the employee, so there might be some coordination issue. So what might be the possible issue regarding the coordination in larger scales?
Yeah, so again, the large organizations, and this we found in our work in this study as well, because again, reviewers have pushed back on different components to it. And what we see is that in smaller organizations, there's a greater kind of average level of flexibility than there is in larger organizations. So go back to the correlation matrix and seeing that negative correlation between size and flexibility. So yeah, the larger organizations, our explanation is that larger organizations, as they grow, they try to create more standardized processes, and it tends to be specialization. So if you go back to Kotz and Kahn's book on the social psychology of organizing, they talk about the idea of differentiation and specialization, that as organizations grow, they become more differentiated, more specialized. And then that requires a greater need for coordination across those. And so I think in large organizations, that's exactly what happens, is that specialization and differentiation, it actually kind of creates a pressure towards inflexibility. And the coordination is required to be able to coordinate activities across these specialized or differentiated functions. And so to me, that's why you see less flexibility in large organizations, and why you see a greater payoff for building that flexibility into large organizations, is because of that differentiation and coordination trade-off that Kotz and Kahn talked about back in the 1960s.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
For the question.
Mariam, would you like to ask a question? She's also our student.
Hello, Ojam. Hello, Professor.
Hi.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity, and thank you, Professor, for the information. It was very clear and good, and I don't have any question. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a question. So what might be the different research areas in the field of human resource management besides flexibility? What might be your suggestions for us, for new researchers?
Well, so again, going back to I've been in the field for too long now, for over 35, 40 years. So I've seen the evolution. Early on, it was all about kind of conceptual models of strategic HR and the idea of fit. And then it turned into, when Mark Huslett came out with his 95 paper, looking at HR practices and performance, that really just caused a massive kind of flood of research around the relationship between HR practices and performance. HR flexibility stuff that kind of came side by side, but certainly wasn't nearly as popular. And then we got into the strategic human capital piece. one of the things that I think is probably the greater area right now is in that human capital area, less on the practices and more on the people, for a few reasons. One is that it provides that link between the strategy and the HR literature. Both are focused on human capital, but from different perspectives. And so I think the strategic human capital piece is important. But the second thing is that if you go back to the models of the HR practices and performance, all of that, kind of has this, what we referred to as the black box. You implement these practices, you get performance. What happens in between? Well, it has to have something to do with the impact of those practices on people. Is it increasing their skill sets? Is it increasing their engagement? Is it increasing their retention? What is it about the people that's driving performance that the HR practices help to develop? And so to me, that's the more interesting question today, is understanding the relationship between the people in terms of the human capital and performance, and HR practices only in so much as you're showing that relates to creating these kinds of people, or this, what in the 92 piece I wrote of, I talked about as the human capital pool. But how it's impacting the human capital pool that is responsible for the actual success of the business. And so if I was giving advice, I'd say less around HR practices, more around the people that actually impact the success of a business.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question. What might be your suggestions for academic leaders? Okay, because they have very qualified HR. Okay, they're managing the professors. They're managing the associate professors. So, what might be your ideas for the academic leaders, for directors, vice rectors, deans, and department chairs? What should they do? How should they manage this pool?
Well, I think we can all agree that they should pay us a lot more. So let's start with that. No, but as you mentioned, you're the department chair. I just became the department chair in our department as well. So I have a similar challenge. To me, it is, for us, I think as faculty members, pay is less important about, we're not doing anything other than pay sends a signal about how much we're valued. And so I think, trying to keep pay competitive is important. It's not that it's the end all. It's not that what really motivates people to work harder. It just is a way to keep people around. I think most of what we want as faculty members is kind of respect and opportunities for development. And so, using resources to provide people the opportunities to develop themselves. So that may be going to conferences, it may be building networks, it may be doing those kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons that what we've tried to do with our Center for Executive Succession is to create research accounts for our faculty members that they can spend however they want. So if they want to subscribe to a journal because they want to read and develop that way, they can do that. If they want to go to a conference, they don't have to present a paper, they can go to the conference and network and learn from others. And so to me, the key with a administrator is to show respect for the faculty, that you respect what they do and value what they do, and then to provide resources to help them develop themselves in a way that they choose is the mechanism through which they want to grow as a faculty member.
Okay, thank you. Of course, there should be also equal promotional opportunities as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which is, I think, often a sign of the valuing and respecting, is that if we're not promoting them, it's showing that we don't value them and we don't respect them.
Exactly. Okay, thank you very much, dear Professor Wright. It was our honor to host you today, and we would like to see you in our university in Istanbul, in Turkey, as soon as possible, whenever you want. Please keep in touch. Maybe we can conduct a joint research. I'll be more than happy to participate this type of global research, and of course, Osman Hoca will be more than happy to do this. So please keep in touch with us. We are very happy that we met with you, and we would like to see you in our university whenever you want.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for participating. I appreciate it.
Thank
Have
you
a
very
great day.
much. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Take care.